everyone in that area, that's a public bad that falls on all those people, right? So this is not that different from externalities, but the victim's knowledge is going to be really important to what we're going to consider. Often, unlike in externalities, we assume that people have some property rights in these contexts which make it possibly illegal for you to just force them to accept the public bad. Yeah, go ahead.
Why FCC spectrum reassembly is like categorized as a public bad? Because like there's auction, and if some people don't sell because they value higher, they just are.
But that's true now, Mohammed. That's true now, but that's only because we've already told the people that they're going to all be reorganized to different parts of the spectrum. But initially people were on particular parts of the spectrum, right? And being forced to move was sort of a public bad on all those people, right? They were given some compensation, but there was some harm that accrued to everyone by being forced to move the parts of the spectrum that they were on. Okay, so the holdup problem is that everyone demands a large payment in order to accept these diffuse harms. So let me go through a model of this. And the first model of this was actually in Cournot's original book. So that was an amazing book. That book supplied the first monopoly model ever. It supplied the first model of competition ever. And it supplied the first model of public goods ever. So if you guys do something on that order of magnitude for your dissertation, I think you'll be doing pretty well. He considered this model of collaboration, which is that there are n firms, but now rather than producing substitutable goods, they produce goods that are complementary with one another. In particular, imagine they're perfect complements, so consumers need to have all the goods in order for any of them, in order to get any value from them, right? That's a little bit like what we were saying with the land example from before, right? It's like not worth getting it unless you can get all the land, right? So in that case, the quantity that's sold of the good depends on the sum of all the prices, because only the total good is worth anything to the consumers, right? Notice that that means that the diversion ratio from each firm to every other firm, rather than being a positive number, is a negative number now. Because if I increase my price and that reduces my sales, that actually reduces other people's sales. And in fact, it reduces their sales by exactly as much as it reduces my sales, because people only buy the goods as a whole. So the diversion ratio is actually -1, right? Now, for simplicity, let's assume constant marginal cost for each of the firms. The firm's profits are price minus marginal cost times the total quantity, or their markup times this should be a plus here, sorry, times the total sum of all the markups plus the sum of all the costs, right? So this problem looks very familiar. Basically, everyone is taking the prices of all the other firms as given rather than the quantities of all the other firms as given. Quantity depends on the sum of the prices rather than price depending on the sum of the quantities, as in Cournot's other problem. And profits are the product of price, or here actually markup, and quantity, right? So this is exactly identical to Cournot's model of competition, except that the role played by markup and quantity are interchanged with one another. So we can literally take everything out of the Cournot model and just switch the words quantity and markup, and we get the exact same conclusion. Okay, so that means that as the number of firms grow, the prices rise and the quantities fall, rather than the prices falling and the quantities rising, right? This is sometimes called double marginalization, because every firm is trying to get its own monopoly markup, and they're getting added on top of one another. More formally, notice that, remember that in differentiated products Nash pricing, the conduct parameter, right, of each firm was equal to 1 minus the aggregate diversion ratio. But the aggregate diversion ratio here is the sum over all the other firms of -1. So the conduct parameter now is 1 plus the number of firms other than you, which is equal to n. So the conduct parameter now is equal to n. The conduct is getting further and further above monopoly as the number of firms gets larger, right? So each firm, and the reason is that each firm, when raising its price, doesn't internalize the harm to the other firms, right? Because when they raise their price, they reduce the number of sales to the other firm. So other firms wish they charged a lower price rather than a higher price as under competition, right? So that means that merging the firms would actually lead to lower prices. And this is the reason why there's very different policy towards vertical mergers or firms pooling together complementary patents than there is towards horizontal mergers or firms pulling together substitutable patents. Because we think that if you put together a bunch of complementary patents, that people will actually have an incentive to reduce what they're charging. Because they won't want to sort of like grab the whole market for fear in order to get their markup, right? They won't hold hostage the whole process in order to earn their profits, right? So there's a natural reverse of Cournot's theorem here. As n gets large in this context, Daiichi, what's going to happen?
Quantity should go to 0.
Yeah, and the price is going to go to the point where there's no sales, right? Just as markups before went to 0, quantities are now going to go to 0, right? Now, while each firm's markup is individually small, collectively they kill all the demand. So this is very pessimistic. Layers of monopoly destroy the whole market. And basically, the reasoning here, while it's phrased in terms of these firms with complementary products, is basically the same as the logic of the tragedy of commons, or what's called the collective action problem. So let's consider a very similar, but perhaps even more famous problem. Imagine that there are a bunch of people who can each make a contribution AI to a charity, and the value that each person gets depends only on the total amount that's donated to the charity. And assume that people have a positive marginal utility for donations to the charity, for everyone, right? Then the value to each individual is just the value they get minus the cost of the donation, while the value to society is the sum of the values of each individual minus the cost of the donation. So the contribution brings a total social value of capital V prime, but each individual only gets little vi prime, right? So if things are symmetric, for example, if everyone's the same, then every individual person is going to set v prime divided by n equal to 1, whereas society would set v prime equal to 1, right? So you get the same result as Cournot. As the number of people gets large, the wedge, the amount of loss that we get relative to what society would provide gets arbitrarily large, because everyone free rides hoping that everyone else will contribute, right? So in a large population with voluntary contributions, public goods are going to become arbitrarily underprovided. Okay. So these problems, I think, sound pretty pervasive. The question is, what are some solutions we could use for them? I'm going to try to argue that you're going to have to use coercion. But first, I want to consider the private solutions that have been proposed in the past. So one is just altruism. If people do things because to be public spirited, like, giving to charity or voting or volunteering for the military, those are sort of public contributions to public goods. They are things people wouldn't do if they were acting in sort of the classic notion of their self-interest. And culture can play a important role in promoting these, motivated either by prestige. You want to look good for other people, maybe potentially future mates, that it makes you feel good about yourself because you've sort of internalized the cultural values, or because you're trying to signal to people that you would be a good person. And if this is a signal that we've sort of coordinated on of what constitutes a good person, then it may be useful to you for your career to contribute to these public goods. And I think there's no question that all these things help and are important social tools. but they require the slow development of a culture that values those things. And therefore, for many like modern things like infrastructure projects or whatever, it's going to be very hard to get people to contribute anywhere near the efficient amount on those. So I think altruism can be useful, but it's certainly not going to be sufficient. And in particular, on public bads, this is not really going to happen often because people don't really value the idea of, say, accepting less for their home so that other people can have the ability to sell their home, right? Even though that has exactly the same structure of a problem, if someone else is getting an offer for their home that's contingent on you selling your home and is more than they're willing to accept, then there is a public service you're doing them by reducing the amount that you demand, being less of a holdout. But I think people are much less likely to make that sort of a contribution because we don't have the sort of cultural norms around it. Yeah, Kentaro, what's up?
Yeah, so is it also beneficial to sort of provide people incentive by by giving them some social reputation
Yeah.
for participating in it? And is that different
Yeah.
from altruism? In that?
I mean, all these things I think are different mechanisms we have as a society to reward people for contributing and to various things and internalize externalities. And they have different advantages, like, money from the government, coercion, cultural things, etc., all have costs and benefits associated with them, which I wasn't planning to go into very much, but I think you can sort of think through some of them. We talked about them actually when we talked about incentive theory back in the Theory of the Firm lecture, right? All these are basically ways of getting people to contribute to public goods, and I think there's costs and benefits of each of them, and they're used in different contexts. And sort of what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit independent of that. It's an issue of like, what is the optimal thing to do in terms of the sum of all those incentives we provide. How you divide among the different incentives, I think, depends on the considerations we were talking about in that lecture.
Because I just read the paper, I think, by somebody, which basically talks about how to promote like peer reviewing system
Yeah.
of economic papers, and they did a bunch of experiments and providing sort of many economists like providing some incentives like listing their names on
Yeah.
the paper so that they
Yeah.
feel that they acquire some social reputation,
Yeah.
or just giving them some amount of cash, and they find that that is actually positively promoting the
See, I mean, I think that the problem with a lot of these experiments is that they're not theoretically informed enough. I mean, the thing is, we know that there's lots of things that you could do to incentivize people, right? And it's worth thinking through some of the theory of like, what are the trade-offs in these different incentives, and then trying to measure the trade-offs. Because I mean, yeah, if you're just trying to say, does it stimulate effort more? That's like such a paltry part of the thing. We want to know, does it stimulate the right kind of effort? Does it stimulate writing good reports? Does it work? I mean, we know that for these different types of incentives, there are different pluses and minuses, and you really want to measure those types of pluses and minuses in the experiment, not just like, does it increase the number of people who respond to the thing? You know what I mean?
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this experiment was that naive or not, but that would be a concern I would have. You know what I mean? Okay. So if goods or bads are relatively local and it's easy for people to move around, then people can move to the place where the public good provision is sort of good and away from the places where the public good provision is bad, or at least good for them and bad for them. And this is called T-BOO competition. Local areas compete in the provision to attract people. And this is important for many local public services like street cleaning, schools, police,